The frost had come early that December. By the third week, the trenches of the Western Front, cut deep into the soil of northern France and Belgium, were choked with frozen mud and the stink of damp wool, blood, and unwashed bodies. Opposing lines were often less than 100 yards apart, divided only by the ravaged no-man's land, where barbed wire sprawled like iron brambles, and the remnants of previous charges lay half-buried in snow and soil. The British soldiers, weary and stiff from weeks of near-constant vigilance, had grown used to the crack of distant rifle fire and the sudden thud of mortar shells. It had become routine: the call to arms at dawn, the occasional sniper's shot, the sound of men coughing in the cold or cursing as trench walls collapsed under their boots. Across the no-man's land, the Germans endured the same bitter routine. The war, which many had believed would be over by Christmas, had instead descended into a brutal stalemate of trench warfare. The barbed wire was thick, the rats grew fat on scraps, and the cold seeped into the bones of every man, British or German alike. Then, in the final days before Christmas, something strange happened. Reports began to filter through the lines of an eerie silence in certain sectors. The usual bursts of machine gun fire had ceased. A few soldiers claimed to have heard the sound of carols, soft, foreign, melodic, drifting across the front lines. On Christmas Eve, the stillness deepened. Frost sparkled under a cloudless night sky. From the German trenches came the unmistakable notes of Stille Nacht. British soldiers listened in silence, some joining in with their own English version, Silent Night, their voices hesitant but rising. By morning, the war had momentarily vanished. Cautiously, heads began to rise over trench parapets. Rifles remained nearby, but hands did not reach for them. A few brave men from both sides stepped into no man's land, not with weapons, but with open palms. British soldiers of the Royal Welsh, London Rifle Brigade, and others met German troops from Saxon and Bavarian regiments in the middle of the killing field that had claimed so many lives only weeks before no shots were fired. No orders were given. What passed between them was an unspoken understanding, an acknowledgement of shared suffering, of the human cost that transcended borders and uniforms. The air was filled with tentative greetings, gestures of goodwill, and broken words in each other's tongue. Some exchanged cigarettes, others swapped badges, food, or even buttons from their tunics. A few produced footballs, and in the snow-patched mud, makeshift matches were played with laughter replacing gunfire. Throughout the day, the truce held in some sectors. Officers on both sides permitted the brief peace, wary but willing. Elsewhere, unofficial agreements were made. We won't shoot if you don't. Not everywhere on the front saw such truces, and in some places the fighting continued as normal. But in that thin line stretching across parts of the Western Front, Christmas brought a fleeting moment of humanity by nightfall. Most soldiers had returned to their lines. Orders had begun to circulate, reminding men that this was still a war, that peace was not policy. By Boxing Day, the crack of rifles and the dull thud of artillery resumed. The war would drag on for nearly 4 more years, claiming millions. Yet for one day the killing had stopped. In the silence between trenches, enemies had met as men. The Christmas Truce of 1914 became a powerful reminder, however brief, that even in war, the soul can resist. Private Albert Moran of the Queen's Regiment recalled the moment. It was a beautiful moonlit night, frost on the ground, white almost everywhere, and we saw some lights, little Christmas trees on their parapets. Slowly, figures rose above the trenches. No rifles, no orders, just quiet steps across frozen ground. Lieutenant Johannes Niemann of the 133rd Saxon Regiment remembered. We came up from our trenches and went toward the English. A few of our men met a few English in the middle, and shook hands. For the first time in months, the killing field became a meeting place. Henry Williamson, a 19-year-old private in the London Rifle Brigade, wrote to his mother on Christmas Day. "Dear Mother, I am writing from the trenches. It is Christmas Day. We are all fraternizing with the Germans, smoking their cigars, exchanging postcards. They are jolly good fellows." From handshakes came gifts: chocolate, bread, buttons, tobacco, jam. German Lieutenant Walter Stennis described swapping a tin of meat for jam with a British soldier, both laughing in the cold. Frank Richards of the Royal Welch Fusiliers recalled, "This continued until there were hundreds of men on either side who had left their trenches and were mingling and talking. Then someone found a football." Kurt Zamisch of the 134th Saxon Regiment wrote in his diary, "Eventually the English brought a soccer ball from their trenches, and pretty soon a lively game ensued. How marvellously wonderful, yet how strange it was." Bertie Felstead, another Royal Welch Fusilier, remembered the kickabout. "It wasn't a game as such. More a bit of fun. I should think there were a couple of hundred taking part." Machine guns were silent. Boots kicked through mud instead of marching toward death. Ernie Williams, a machine gunner in the Cheshire Regiment, later said, "They came toward us, shouting, laughing, carrying bottles. I thought it was a trap. But they just wanted to meet us." What struck many was not the novelty, but the familiarity. Ike Sawyer of the Rifle Brigade. "They were just like us, some only boys. We talked about football, about home, and about how strange it all was." John Ferguson of the Seaforth Highlanders never forgot it. "Here were these men who'd killed one another's friends only days earlier. Now we were talking like old mates. I shook hands with at least a dozen Germans." Frederick Heath of the Honourable Artillery Company summed it up. "There was not an atom of hate on either side that day. And yet everyone knew this moment could not last," Karl Aldag, a German soldier, wrote. "There was a sense that this peace could not last. Orders would come, but we took that moment, shared it like men. Even so, some tried to stretch it. Men shared addresses. Some sang again that evening, others posed for photographs, arms slung around former enemies." Lieutenant Johannes Müller later reflected, "We were reprimanded it would not happen again. But for a few hours, it did." Not every sector of the line experienced the truce. In some places, fighting never stopped. In others, peace endured into Boxing Day. But where it happened, the memory remained. Not as a footnote, but as a signal that even in the heart of war, men might still recognize each other as brothers. The light faded early that evening. A pale sun sank behind the wrecked barns of Flanders and turned the frost to glass. Across the front, the laughter that had filled the air only hours earlier thinned into scattered voices. Then into murmurs. Some soldiers still lingered in no man's land, reluctant to return to the darkness of the trenches. Others knelt in the snow, saying quiet prayers for the men they had just met. Candles flickered along the parapets. Empty tins became makeshift holders, their flames trembling in the wind. From both sides drifted carols once more, O Tannenbaum, the first Noel, melodies overlapping until the languages blended into one. British and German burial parties worked side by side, using the same shovels to cover the frozen dead. The stench of decay mixed with the clean scent of pine from the small Christmas trees the Germans had brought up the line. For a few hours, the most terrible place on earth looked almost peaceful. Letters written that night speak of a strange stillness. Corporal Clifton Stockwell of the Royal Welch described standing shoulder to shoulder with a German officer as they read from the same pocket Bible. "When we finished," he wrote, "we shook hands once more, saluted, and returned to our own trenches. There was not a shot fired all night." At dawn on Boxing Day, the frost hardened again. Some men waved across the lines, hoping to keep the truce alive a little longer. But orders had arrived. Company commanders reminded their men that fraternizing with the enemy was an offense punishable by court-martial. Ammunition was issued. New targets were marked. The rifles, cleaned and oiled the night before, waited in silence. In many sectors, the peace collapsed as quickly as it had begun. A single shot, no one knows from which side, echoed near Armentières, and the spell broke. Men ducked, instinct took over, and the war resumed. The smoke of gunfire replaced the scent of tobacco and candle wax. In some sectors, the ceasefire lingered into New Year, but everywhere, eventually, the machinery of war reclaimed its rhythm. Those who took part found it difficult to speak of afterward. Some felt ashamed. Others clung to the memory as proof that the hatred preached from above was not absolute. Diaries from both armies describe the same hollow feeling, the sense that something pure had been glimpsed and lost. Punishments followed. British soldiers were removed from the line for conduct to the prejudice of good order. German officers were censured and warned, and a few were reassigned for what their superiors called unmilitary behavior. But their letters, the ones that slipped past the censors, preserved what their superiors could not erase: a shared decency, a shared humanity. Winter dragged on. The snow melted into mud again, swallowing the footprints of the men who had met in peace. Yet their small rebellion lingered. Some kept souvenirs, buttons, badges, cigarette cases, quiet relics of sanity. Years later, veterans still spoke of the faces they saw in that pale winter light. Private Frederick Bromley remembered a young Saxon soldier pressing a photograph of his wife into his hand. He looked about 19. Bromley said, "He smiled, and I never saw him again." Historians debate whether the truce changed anything. The war raged on until 1918, devouring millions, but to the men who lived through that single day, it revealed a truth no order could silence: that the enemy was human. That mercy could surface even in the mud of Flanders. Commanders ensured it would never happen again. Christmas 1915 came under bombardment. No songs crossed the wire. Yet rumors persisted that in some quiet corner of the front, when the guns paused for a heartbeat, a faint carol might still drift across the darkness. The Christmas Truce did not end the Great War, but it left behind a question neither army could bury. If men could choose peace for one day, why not for longer? And though the frost of that December melted long ago, the memory endures, passed down in letters, diaries, and the quiet wonder of those who heard the story later. Because for one night in 1914, amid the mud and the madness, soldiers remembered what it meant to be human.